You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. This is Alice Lanyadoo bringing you Curtain Up, our programme all about Russian culture. This week on the programme, I've invited in Jessica Duchesne to talk about her new literary concert, Alicia's Gift, which is on at various venues this and next month. It's based on her novel of the same name and is about a child musical prodigy. One of the themes it explores is how music is taught in Russia and the UK. I started by asking Jessica what drew her to the topic of child musical prodigies.
It's a topic that I've always been fascinated by, as I think a lot of music lovers are. The phenomenon of the child prodigy has been with us over the centuries, and people like Mozart, Mendelssohn, and many, many great performers have actually started off as child prodigies. There's always something very compelling for an audience about witnessing a child who is able to do something that you would think only an adult could do. Whether that's a good thing is quite another matter, and the sort of pressures that those children come under sometimes really do not bear closer scrutiny.
You read music at Cambridge and you've worked in music publishing and now classical music journalism, as well as putting on literary concerts and writing books. What experience do you have of child prodigies in classical music?
Well, I've met a number of them and I've interviewed a number of them as well. And I've read a lot of books about former prodigies such as Jascha Heifetz, for example. I've been following the career of Benjamin Grosvenor over the years. I first saw him play when he was 12 years old and was in the final of Young Musician of the Year. And frankly, I couldn't believe my eyes or my ears. He's now 21 and emerging as one of Britain's finest, most exciting young musicians. So he's one of the heartening stories. But I've constantly found that as the years go by and figures like Yevgeny Kissin have grown up, a lot of people are just waiting for something to go wrong. And they kind of assume that, that there's a disaster waiting to happen. Now, Kissin has fundamentally disproved that he seems to me to be strong as an ox, and he is probably about 40 by now and playing as wonderfully as he was when he was 12. So it can go both ways. But I mean, my own experience, I wasn't a child prodigy. I did want very much to be a pianist. And in my time as a music student, I encountered a lot of people who had been prodigies. And I watched them in some cases pull through and in some cases not.
Do you think then it's very much a mixed blessing to be a child who plays so very well?
I think it's extremely dangerous. Obviously, the best people like Kissin, like Benjamin Grosvenor, are going to make it. But for everyone that does, there are actually a lot that don't, because the weight of expectation that is placed on their shoulders and the sort of fuss that's made over them when they're very young can be incredibly counterproductive. For example, I remember one person I met who was about the same age as me on a music course, who everyone was making a huge, huge fuss. Here's the next superstar. She was 16, she was beautiful, she was playing like Concorde taking off. A couple of years later, she started having memory lapses. And I have no idea what's become of her. But she had been somehow built up to think that she was going to have it all on a plate. And then you reach music college, you realise that there are a lot of other people out there, and it can be very, very hard to cope with that.
Tell us a bit about Alicia's story then.
Well, the story of Alicia's Gift is that Alicia is a child prodigy growing up in a small town in Derbyshire, in Buxton. And she comes under a lot of pressure from her parents, notably her mother, who is kind of trying in a way to bury her own grief over something that has happened to her previously in Alicia's talent. Alicia is a very, relatively anyway, normal young girl. She wants nothing more than to find the perfect teacher and to be able to develop her playing and to go running with her dog. And of course, all this proves a lot easier said than done. So part of the book really concerns her search for the right guidance, which she finds is in very short supply. And this actually forms the heart of the concert version. We see her moving from a terribly strict teacher to a rather sort of louche, charming concert pianist who has certain designs upon her, to a situation where she's led to a kind of guru who is her ideal teacher but happens to be on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean.
And is this something you've encountered? Is this based on children you've met, or is it purely a product of your imagination?
Basically, it's pure imagination, but it has been fed very much by my experiences in the classical music industry over the past 25 years. I've seen bits of all of these situations, and I've certainly encountered one or two Professor Feinsteins. So he's the good guy.
So does she find him in the end, or perhaps we won't tell our listeners that for the moment?
Well, she has a lot of other things to deal with on her journey to find him, let's say that. But it would be very nice if you would like to know what happens, then please come and hear one of our concerts.
I wanted to know a bit more how a concert of a novel works in practice. What kind of experience is it going to be for the audience?
I think one very good thing about this format, and one thing that I'm keen to develop about it, is that these concerts are 300% accessible whether or not you know anything about classical music. A friend came recently to one of my other concerts of the novel, based on my novel Hungarian Dancers. She's an old school friend of mine, and she said, well, I'm tone deaf. I don't know anything about music. Will I be able to enjoy it? And I said, well, yes, of course, because it's telling a story. And she came along with her mother and her husband and her mother-in-law and her brother, and they all had a great time because they didn't feel intimidated by feeling that they had to know every analytical detail of the piece of music. The music becomes part of the storytelling.
So you narrate, do you? And do you have a pianist with you? How does it work?
Yes, exactly. Alicia's Gift is a project for myself as narrator and a wonderful pianist friend of mine named Viv McLean, who's a delightful person to work with and a beautiful musician to listen to. In fact, the concert was his idea because he played with the violinist in the Hungarian Dancers concert. He read Alicia's Gift and he said to me, I really love this book. Couldn't we do a concert of this one too? And I thought about it a bit and I thought, well, actually we could. So we are. And one of the highlights is Viv's party piece, which is Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue, which I would challenge anyone to play in a more sparkly way.
Now, thinking about gifted children and the teaching of music, how does your concert tackle the issue of how to teach music? I'm thinking of the British way, the Russian way, different ways around the world.
In fact, this is a pretty central topic to the book and especially to the concert version. Alicia's very strict teacher, who she's taken to at the age of 12 to start really developing her technique, is extremely scathing about music teaching in Britain. She objects to the way that British children are fed exams and sport and more sport, but there is no real system for teaching music. And she cites her own experience at the Moscow Conservatoire, where she tells Alicia that she found she was taught to be an artist, not a performing monkey.
So she's a Russian teacher?
She's a British teacher who has trained in Russia.
Right.
And has been through this very systematic, very hard-working training that Russian young musicians do go through. And that is, as far as I can tell, is considered very much the way to do things there. Whereas here, people sort of throw up their hands in horror if you actually make a child work at something. Somehow everything's supposed to happen by magic. And of course, it doesn't happen by magic. You do have to work hard. And this, I'm sure, is why Russian pianists on the whole have such an advantage when it comes to winning piano competitions, for instance. They actually have that training much more thoroughly at a much earlier age than British youngsters. And it has to happen young.
Although conversely, I mean, isn't there a danger sometimes that you can push children too hard and they miss out on their childhood?
Well, of course, but if they miss out on their childhood, I mean, nobody wants a child to miss out on being a child. But on the other hand, if there is a major gift to develop there, then maybe that's what they want to do, some of them. And the ones that are going to make it probably do want to develop that gift. And if they don't put in the hard graft early enough, they're never going to have a hope in hell of making it.
So that kind of teaching doesn't really come into play here until you're at university or college level?
Yes, by which time it's too late. For instance, in Britain, we don't have this network of local music schools that Russians have all over the country. Here it's very localised, and it is in a certain way almost a kind of postcode lottery, whether there are good teachers in your area and whether there's a supportive local authority with a music centre for Saturday mornings, which incidentally are being closed because of funding cutbacks. It's very, very haphazard compared to the Russian system.
So really, by cutting down on music teaching and not allowing children to be pushed a bit harder, we're really failing children here.
We may be failing some children, yes. It's hard to know exactly how much, but I think we do need to look a little bit at our own attitudes.
It's always awfully hard, isn't it, to persuade the public of the need for music teaching. For some reason, it always comes bottom of the list.
I'm afraid that that's very much the case, and partly it's tradition. I mean, we don't have the tradition in Britain of music teaching that is the case in Russia or Germany or France, for example.
So it's a bit of anti-intellectualism?
Partly that, but also partly, I mean, if you think about British culture, our leading elements of culture are our theatre and our literature. And I think, since the days of Shakespeare, we've been world leaders in that. But music has never held the same position. And if you think about the composers who came here in the 19th century, like Chopin and Liszt, I mean, most of them couldn't get out fast enough. They were really fairly disgusted by the Philistinism of the British, and they hated the weather.
Well, I don't think the weather's improved since, although perhaps the musical map has a bit with Britain's centenary this month and a lot of great events around that here in Russia, all over the world. In other cultural news, we've seen a change of leadership at the Vaganova Ballet Academy in St. Petersburg, which also leads me to think about teaching. People are worried there that the standards of teaching will change. It strikes me that they're still doing something right, because the Royal Ballet has trouble producing British dancers, whereas the Russians don't have that problem yet. A lot of the students at the Vaganova are not only from Russia, they're from St. Petersburg itself. Whereas in Britain, there's still an issue, isn't there, around getting British dancers on our stages?
Yes, I think that's very much the case. On one hand, I don't think it's entirely a bad thing, because ballet in Britain is a very, very international art. I was recently lucky enough to watch the ballet Rumba in rehearsal with the Israeli choreographer Barak Marshall, creating a new work for them. And I looked at the company and I said to him, did you want a very ethnically diverse group for this particular ballet? Did you choose each one? And he said, this is the nature of ballet Rumba. It's incredibly diverse. There are Russians and Poles and Afro-Caribbeans and South Americans and someone who's Spanish, and it's incredibly diverse and incredibly exciting. And at the Royal Ballet, you have principals, you have some British principals like Edward Watson, who's one of the best dancers I've ever seen. At the same time, you have Carlos Acosta, who's another of the best dancers I've ever seen. You have Marianela Nunes from Argentina. You have Sarah Lamb from America. It's very diverse, and I like that. I like the fact that all these people can come together and create something special that is unique to London. At the same time, given the levels of training available at the Royal Ballet School, I think it would be very nice if there were some more British stars coming through. Probably the last major star we had was Darcy Bussell. Lauren Cuthbertson is a wonderful dancer, has been plagued by injuries, which hopefully she's getting over now.
Yes, I saw her in Alice. She was fantastic. But do you think that's again about training, a bit like in classical music? Do you think there's a similarity here?
I think there's more training available at that kind of level in classical music than there is in ballet. I don't see those sort of... there are a few very distinguished ballet schools dotted around the country, but I can only think of about 3 of them. And whether they are producing star quality people is very difficult to say.
And do you think we ought to be doing something about that?
It's very difficult to say, well, it's all got to be tougher when stories come out constantly of the kind of suffering that young dancers went through in ballet institutions maybe 30 years ago. I've come across instances of ex-dancers who've been full of the stories of the sort of anorexia that they found themselves suffering, sometimes almost at the instigation of their school.
But I'm also thinking of a will on the part of the government and ballet institutions to get more youngsters interested in ballet here and fund that, because, as you know, that comes into it too.
Very much so, yes. I think ballet and contemporary dance are sometimes seen as I'd hate to say the poor relation, but almost a sort of Cinderella art compared to theatre and literature, and even classical music is kind of ahead of the game when it comes to public opinion. Ballet and contemporary dance are rather niche interests, even in that context. And I think that's a pity.
Well, now Christmas is coming up, and this is perhaps not contemporary dance we're talking about, but I've just looked and we've got quite a few nutcrackers coming up. We've got the Royal Opera House's Nutcracker, English National Ballet. Further afield, the Birmingham Royal Ballet, which is one I'd particularly like to see, the Scottish Ballet, and Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake at Sadler's Wells. Are you going to see any of them, Jessica?
If I go to any, I will go to Matthew Bourne's Swan Lake, thank you very much, because I have got nutcrackers coming out of my ears. I think enough is enough. I think it's time that someone created a really wonderful new Christmas ballet.
Have you seen his Swan Lake before?
I have. I've seen it many times, and I think it is a work of absolute genius.
Because I must say, I found his Nutcracker slightly disappointing. I think Swan Lake's a much bigger work.
I think his Swan Lake is probably his strongest creation to date, though I did see his Sleeping Beauty last Christmas, and I absolutely adored it. Whether that concept that he's come up with there will survive the fad for Twilight when that eventually subsides, we'll have to wait and see. But I think there is something very true and very timeless about his Swan Lake, and it is incredibly powerful and very, very moving. So more power to his elbows and knees.
Well, no Nutcracker for you. I must admit I will be going to at least one or two Nutcrackers, but I understand it's not something for everyone. Thank you very much for coming in, Jessica Duchesne.
Thank you.
That was Jessica Duchesne talking to me, Alice Lanyadoo, for our culture programme, Curtain Up. This is The Voice of Russia in London. Stay with us.
So he's one of the heartening stories. But I've constantly found that as the years go by and figures like Yevgeny Kissin have grown up, a lot of people are just waiting for something to go wrong. And they kind of assume that, that there's a disaster waiting to happen. Now, Kissin has fundamentally disproved that he seems to me to be strong as an ox. And he is probably about 40 by now, witnessing a child who is able to do something that you would think only an adult could do. Whether that's a good thing is quite another matter, and the sort of pressures that those children come under sometimes really do not bear closer scrutiny.
You read music at Cambridge, and you've worked in music publishing and now classical music journalism, as well as putting on literary concerts and writing books. What experience do you have of child prodigies in class? You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. This is Alice Lanyadoo bringing you Curtain Up, our programme all about Russian culture. This week on the programme, I've invited in Jessica Duchesne to talk about her new literary concert, Alicia's Gift, which is on at various venues this and next month. It's based on her novel of the same name and is about a child musical prodigy. One of the themes it explores is how music is taught in Russia and the UK, classical music.
Well, I've met a number of them, and I've interviewed a number of them as well. And I've read a lot of books about former prodigies such as Jascha Heifetz, for example. I've been following the career of Benjamin Grosvenor over the years. I first saw him play when he was 12 years old and was in the final of Young Musician of the Year. And frankly, I couldn't believe my eyes or my ears. He's now 21 and emerging as one of Britain's finest, most exciting young musicians.
I started by asking Jessica what drew her to the topic of child musical prodigies.
It's a topic that I've always been fascinated by, as I think a lot of music lovers are. The phenomenon of the child prodigy has been with us over the centuries, and people like Mozart, Mendelssohn, and many, many great performers have actually started off as child prodigies. There's always something very compelling for an audience about